Hello, everybody. I'm Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform in London, together with my colleague Ian Bond, who's in a different bit of London. We're going to have a members seminar, especially for members of the CER, plus a few alumni and board members and one or two other people, about the situation in Russia and Ukraine. If you want more than we can give you this afternoon, I hope you've all had a listen to, or will listen to soon, the podcast we put up yesterday of Ian talking to Christina Parandi in Kiev and Mary and Dumula in Paris about how they saw the situation in Ukraine and Russia. But today it's just Ian and me, and this is a special members webinar. Ian is going to talk about how he sees the current situation on the ground, some of the diplomacy around it, and the issue of sanctions. And I'll add a few remarks about some of the strategic consequences, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from around the audience. We've got some very distinguished people in the audience today, so I'll make sure there's plenty of time for audience contributions. Ian, would you like to tell us how you see it on a day when there have been reports of shelling in the Donbass, both sides blaming the other side? There were reports a few days ago that Ukrainian troops had, that Russian troops had pulled back from the borders of Ukraine, which NATO says is not the case. How does it look to you?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Charles. I mean, those of you who were on the call about 3 weeks ago when we discussed this will know that I said I was pessimistic about the situation. And if you expect me to say today that I was wrong and the crisis is over, you're going to be disappointed. I think that the crisis is still very much alive. So what's going on the ground? I mean, the military buildup is continuing. The latest figures from the US are that more than 150,000 troops are near the border. That's more than half of Russia's ground forces, so that's quite significant. And units have come from all over Russia, including from the Far East. And military or ex-military figures like the British Defense Secretary and his American counterpart have been flagging up two things that are unusual in exercises, which is the construction of a field hospital and the apparent movement of blood supplies. I mean, both of those are things that you do if you think you're actually going to sustain casualties, rather than things that you do during an exercise. Apart from what's going on the land, Russia has also announced naval exercises in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. One of the consequences of those exercises is that it makes it extremely difficult for ships to access Ukraine's main ports, places like Odessa and on the Black Sea and Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. That's economically quite a problem for Ukraine, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There's been a lot of diplomacy over the last few weeks. As you will know, both Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz visited Kiev and Moscow. I think there was something of a good cop, bad cop routine in their Moscow visit. Macron empathized with the trauma suffered by the Russian people since the end of the Cold War. Scholz was rather firm about human rights and closure of NGOs and things like that. Whether that was a coordinated effort, I'm not sure. I assume it was. French, German, Russian, and Ukrainian officials have met in the so-called Normandy format to discuss implementation of the Minsk agreements. That's the agreements that brought about a ceasefire in 2014, or a sort of ceasefire, at least a partial ceasefire in 2014 and 2015. They didn't really make much progress. I mean, the two sides continue to disagree about what the agreements mean and what order they need to be implemented in. And that I think is because the agreements in many ways were imposed by Russia at a time when Ukraine was militarily very weak, and are about the only way that Ukraine can try to regain some of the ground that was lost. There's been a lot of high-level contact. Putin has spoken to Biden and Boris Johnson. We've had, Liz Truss is in Kiev today. She and Ben Wallace have both been in Moscow. The Polish foreign minister, in his capacity as the chairman in office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has also been in Kiev and Moscow. I suppose I take that as being slightly positive in that the Russians have not engaged very much with the OSCE in recent years, and the fact that they were willing to receive the Polish foreign minister is perhaps a slightly encouraging sign, although I wouldn't read too much into it. And on the other side, there's also been quite a lot of outreach to President Zelensky from European countries who are not traditionally interested in this part of the world, like Spain. Now, I'm going to leave Charles to talk about what I think is probably the most significant diplomatic development of the last few weeks, and that's the contacts between Xi Jinping and Putin at the opening of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, and the joint statement that they issued, because I think that has given Russia some comfort that that China will not make difficulties over anything that it plans to do. So what comes next? Well, the Russians say that their exercises will come to a finish. In fact, they say that their exercises in Crimea have already finished, and that they are withdrawing troops from there to their normal locations. And they've said that the exercises in Belarus will finish on the 20th of February. But as I said, at the moment, more troops are still flowing into the area, and some of them are very close to the border, perhaps within 10 kilometers. There's some interesting commercial satellite imagery, which suggests that the Russians have built a pontoon bridge across the Pripyat River, just a few kilometers from the border between Belarus and Ukraine, which would take them into the Chernobyl restricted zone. Now, because that is a radioactively contaminated zone, it's not permanently garrisoned by Ukrainian troops, but it does lie on the shortest route between the Belarusian frontier and Kiev. And it would be quite an interesting area to drive through at high speed before the Ukrainians had any chance to put defensive measures in place if you wanted to strike at Kiev first. And then a word about sanctions, and a reminder. I won't go into details, although I can say more in the Q&A if anybody's interested. But a reminder that apart from any sanctions that the West may impose, Russia is also in a position to impose counter sanctions, particularly in the energy sector. So on Western sanctions, there seems to be pretty good cooperation between the UK, the US, and the EU. I think initially it was the US which had to do some mediation, maybe the wrong word, but at any rate, to be the convener for those discussions of sanctions. Now, everybody has their own ways of putting pressure on the Russians, but it seems to me that at least in the short term, what the US can do may be the most significant. The US has the least to lose economically. I mean, that's always worth bearing in mind when we're being critical of the Germans for being a bit wobbly on sanctions. They've got more at stake than the Americans have. But I've heard from American experts that they are expecting that some major Russian companies, maybe some major Russian banks, will be put on the so-called entities list. And that essentially means that it would be impossible for any American or individual firm to have any financial dealings with them. And in practice, it's a measure which very often deters international firms that have business in the US from dealing with the sanctioned entities. On the UK side, the main issue seems to be focusing on oligarchs, maybe not the right term exactly, but those who are close to Putin and have wealth parked in UK or in UK overseas territories. I think that's useful, but not as useful as it would have been 20 years ago, or even say 8 years ago when Russia first invaded Ukraine. But that seems to be the main British contribution, is likely to be in that sort of area. Olaf Scholz has more or less said that Nord Stream 2 will not start operating if Russia invades Ukraine, although he's curiously reluctant to utter the words Nord Stream 2. So that may still be a controversial issue within his party, within the SPD. But I thought that perhaps the thing that would most keep me awake if I were Putin at the moment is the long-term threat to Russian interests, which was voiced by Ursula von der Leyen in a speech to the European Parliament yesterday, when she said that one of the lessons for the EU to draw from the crisis was that it must end its dependency on Russian gas. Now, there's a big gap between saying that and doing it. But if the EU can carry through that intention, if it can reduce its dependence on Russian gas, then the economic model that has kept Putin in power really would not be able to survive. So finally, what's going to happen next? Well, Putin hasn't pulled the plug on diplomacy. He had one of those weird stage-managed meetings with Sergei Lavrov, where he basically asks Lavrov a question to give Lavrov the chance to deliver a presentation which is intended to be a message to external viewers and listeners rather than news to Putin himself. And at the end of Lavrov's explanation of what was going on the diplomatic front, he and Putin agreed that it was still possible to make progress through diplomacy, but the talks couldn't go on forever. And I think that's probably about right. At the same time, Putin's equipping himself with other options. So the Duma voted this week in favor of asking him to recognize the independence of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. That's to say the entities in the Russian-occupied territories of eastern Ukraine. Now, for the moment, Putin has told Scholz that he prefers to stick to the Minsk agreements. That's to say that Donetsk and Luhansk remain within Ukrainian territory, but semi-autonomous with a lot of Russian influence, enabling them to veto any attempt by Ukraine to integrate with the EU or NATO. But that Duma vote gives Putin the option, if he wants to claim that he has no alternative but to give in to the will of the people. And he told Scholz that the Duma with that vote was representing the views of the Russian population. So that's one option. He could also claim that Ukrainian so-called atrocities against people in the Donbass justify Russian military intervention. Again, he said in his press conference with Scholz that what was happening in the Donbass was genocide. And that's a message which is being amplified by the Russian state media, which claims that the Russians have uncovered mass graves of civilians killed by Ukrainian shelling in 2014 to 2015. Now, one sort of legal note: Russia has been issuing passports to Ukrainians in the occupied areas, and Russian law allows the use of Russian armed forces beyond its borders to protect Russian citizens from attack, which is quite a useful provision if you want a legal justification for intervening in Ukraine. Equally, he could simply hold forces near the border for quite a while yet. There have been estimates that they could stay there for weeks, months, even years, at some cost to their readiness, but they could stay there for a while. And Putin may be hoping that the political and economic pressure on Ukraine forces more significant concessions than we've heard so far. There was a strong hint in the comments that Scholz made to German journalists at the end of his visit about the improbability of Ukrainian membership of NATO. And it might be that indicates that Germany and France will put Zelensky under more pressure formally to rule out pursuing Ukraine's bid for membership, although he won't be able to remove those things from the constitution. They're written into the constitution as aspirations for Ukraine. And one has to say that in terms of economic pressure, so far this crisis is having more effect on Ukraine's economy than on Russia's. First of all, because the US, the UK, and various other Western governments are telling their nationals to leave Ukraine. That has a dampening effect on commercial operations that involve them. Airlines are stopping flights, and insurance for ships sailing to to Ukrainian ports is prohibitively expensive or completely unobtainable. So it's becoming quite difficult for Ukraine to export the goods on which its economy depends. It was a good thing that Ursula von der Leyen spoke yesterday about EU financial help for Ukraine, but realistically, there are limits to how much the EU is going to be able to spend to prop up the Ukrainian economy. So I think that Putin is still waiting to see what he can get without having to fight for it. But I don't think that he has yet got enough concessions to be able to declare victory and withdraw his troops from the border. And I would still put the chance of an attack on Ukraine in the coming days or next couple of weeks at higher than 50%. Perhaps I'll leave it there and let Charles talk about the geopolitical implications.
Thank you very much, Ian. Well, I'm naturally a more optimistic fellow than you are, so I think the chances are a bit less than 50%, but when we both admit that we don't actually know, of course. I'm just an optimist. I think Putin would face too many problems if he went ahead with a serious attack. But let me say a little bit about what some of the consequences of all this may be, whether or not Putin attacks. I mean, one consequence is I think America has to be committed to European security pro tem. I mean, ever since 2008, when Obama took office, the Americans have been saying, let's focus more on Asia, let's spend less time on the Middle East and less time in Europe. But events keep happening, and America just can't do that. And I think if whether or not Russia actually invades Ukraine, America and American politicians will not be able to ignore. They'll have to remain committed to European security, in my view. I think that's one consequence. And a second consequence related to the first one is I think NATO at last has a fairly clear mission and purpose, one based on territorial defense. In the 90s, NATO wasn't quite sure what it was there for. It bombed Kosovo, it bombed Serbia because of the Kosovo crisis, it got involved in Afghanistan and did various other things, and was sort of involved in Libya indirectly. But now clearly NATO is about territorial defense, and that's everybody in NATO agrees with that. And maybe Sweden and Finland will get much closer to NATO than they are already. Whether they become members, I'm a little bit skeptical, but I think NATO knows what it's there for. Third consequence, I think the Europeans are going to take defense much more seriously than they have done. They'll probably spend more money on defense. Macron's ideas, for which he used to call strategic autonomy, but though he now calls it other things, for building up a European defense identity will, I think, flourish, but they'll have to flourish in a rather US compatible direction. The French plans for European defense sometimes put off Poles and Baltics and others because they seem to be or could be seen as hostile to NATO. Now these plans are going to have to be very much NATO compatible. And I think they could involve intervention forces, which Macron's talked about, so that Europe can do more than just send peacekeepers. Might actually be able to do a little bit of real fighting. They're only on a small scale, of course. And then a fourth consequence, I think, is just there's much more intra-European solidarity than there was. Faced with a very serious crisis, it is interesting how the Poles have gone soft in their rule of law dispute with Brussels. President Duda of Poland clearly wants to resolve the matter of the Polish judiciary being branded as lacking independence and therefore incurring the wrath of the Brussels institutions. Duda is looking for a compromise on that. Whether he finds one is not entirely clear, but I think many people in Brussels would be quite happy to try and find a compromise on the issue of the various judicial tribunals in Poland that are too political as far as the EU is concerned. Similarly, look at the UK's own relationship with Europe. Liz Truss, the relatively new Foreign Secretary, has been quite explicit that we need to solve the Northern Ireland Protocol argument between Brussels and London in order to work together better in confronting global challenges like Russia and China. And I think she means it. And the British government has gone soft on its rhetoric on invoking Article 16 and tearing up the Northern Ireland Protocol. There are many reasons for that. One other reason being that Johnson is just very weak as a political leader, so he doesn't want, I think, start a trade war with Brussels. But I think the broader geopolitical context is one reason why London is going soft, and indeed Brussels is not trying to provoke a crisis on the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment. And I think, as you referred, Ian, to Scholz's visit to Moscow, but I think, you know, the Germans have been on a journey with regard to Moscow for the last 10 years or so. The political opinion and public opinion got progressively harder the more Russia misbehaves seen from German eyes. And I thought Scholz was quite tough when he was in Moscow recently, talking about Navalny's case, talking about human rights in a way that he, you know, other social democratic leaders might not have done in the past, certainly not Gerhard Schroeder. So I think the Germans are on a journey towards being tougher towards the Russians. This doesn't mean they're going to sell arms to everybody anytime soon. They may not want to supply troops to neighboring countries as Britain and France are doing, or not so many troops. They will support very tough sanctions and support tough language vis-a-vis Russia. So I think that's another consequence. And then let me fifthly and finally, Ian, mention something you've touched on already, which is Russia's relationship with China. And I hope you'll say a bit more on this yourself later, Ian, because you've spent more time writing about it than I have. But it's clearly that the worse relations are between Russia and the West, the more Russia has to cleave to China, because the Russian economy has very serious underlying weaknesses, in my view. The standard of living has not gone up in the last 10 years for the Russian people. Russian leaders have deliberately not diversified the economy away from hydrocarbon exports because it suits them very well to keep things the way they are, creaming off the rents. And corruption is weighing down as a very heavy cost on the economy. So there are serious economic problems. The economy is about the same size as that of Spain. I mean, to be fair to Putin, it's remarkable that Russia is such an effective and influential geopolitical actor, given that its economy is so small. But in the long run, Putin knows very well that your military and diplomatic power can't be completely out of sync with the size of your economy. So I think that it was very interesting when Putin met Xi at the Winter Olympics quite recently, and this joint statement they produced, which you want to say some more on later, Ian, basically said that China supports Russia's views on NATO enlargement in Europe and supports Russian views on the so-called new European security architecture. And I think, maybe, although China has a strong view on the importance of territorial integrity and national sovereignty, and China does, to be fair, have a fairly good relationship with Ukraine, and it is never recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which fell off from Georgia after Russia invaded in 2008. It's never recognized the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 either. Nevertheless, I suspect Putin has de facto got Xi Jinping to say, if Russia attacks Ukraine, China's not going to create too many problems for Russia, and that maybe China will help Russia to evade Western sanctions. We don't know that for sure, but I think that looks to be something that was brewing in Beijing the other day. Now, all those things I've said, I think work whether or not Russia invades Ukraine. They're just more extreme if Russia does invade Ukraine. America would be even more committed to European security and so on. One thing that I think, and I'll stop with this, one thing that I think does happen only if Russia invades Ukraine, really the so-called Helsinki European order is really and truly over. We'll go from Helsinki to Yalta, by which I mean Helsinki 1975, everybody signed up to, all Europeans, including the Soviet Union, signed up to the idea of territorial integrity, not resolving disputes by use of force, accepting that human rights were relevant inside each other's countries and so on. Yalta was the great men getting together for a big conference and deciding, carving up the map of Europe into spheres of influence. And if Russia succeeds in conquering and maintaining its stranglehold on Ukraine, and indeed it already has a stranglehold on Belarus, then I think that is the end of the Helsinki order of European security, and we're back to something much more closer to how it was in the Cold War. But that's enough from me. Let's Ian, would you like to add something to what I said about China while I ask people to think up their first questions? If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, could you please raise your hand? That is the easiest way for me to see. You can try the chat function. I'd prefer you to raise a hand. And I would like Christine Ockrent, if she could think of, if she doesn't mind too much, to chip in with us some thoughts from Paris, as Christine, a very senior French journalist and commentator, is sitting there in Paris, and we'd love to hear how it looks from Paris. But while people are thinking up their questions and comments, would Ian, you like to say, add to what I said about Russia and China, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think Putin had to give a lot to get what he got from Xi Jinping in terms of the common opposition to NATO enlargement and so on. So, there is a real embrace of lots of Xi Jinping's projects for global development, for the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. Things I suspect that Putin is less interested in, but he is now endorsed, and also a very firm statement on Russia's support for China's approach to Taiwan. But nonetheless, there are clearly some benefits there for Putin. But I think the most important thing is really unstated in the joint statement, and that is, I think that the strength of the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping has given the Russians enough assurance to be able to move many of their troops from the Far East to Belarus and the Ukrainian border. In the past, there's always been this reticence. If we leave the Far East denuded of defense, what will the Chinese do? And I think the Russians are now reaching a point of confidence where they feel able, at least some of the time, not to keep large forces in Siberia and the Russian Far East, but to be able to focus much more on their western frontier.